Do different generations speak different languages?
This podcast is brought to you by Archimed, fast and focused design and manufacturing.
I'm Greg Maurer, founder and owner of Archimed.
And I'm Caroline Squatrigo, talent engagement specialist. We are on a journey to grow, learn, and gain expertise in small to mid-size company culture. Join us.
All right, Caroline, what's the question of the day?
So today we're talking about the generational gap in the workplace. There's so much talk going around, I feel like constantly, about boomers versus Gen X versus millennials versus Gen Z. It almost feels like the generations don't speak the same language, but I think there's a chance that we're overcomplicating this. With four generations in the workplace, this is having a major impact on how we operate. So let's dive in and see if we can figure this out. First, we'll be hearing from someone with a lot of experience working with some younger employees, our assembly team lead, Anthony Johnson, or as we call him, AJ. And then we'll be joined by Lindsay Boccardo. Lindsay is the founder of her own coaching company, and she focuses on maximizing the talent of multiple generations within one workforce. So I think she is going to have a lot to tell us. Well, today I'm really excited. We have Anthony Johnson with us, or we call him AJ at Archimed. And AJ is Archimed's assembly team lead. So he is somebody who works with some of the youngest people in the building. He's worked with high school students all the way through 30-year-olds. And so I think that he's going to have a pretty good perspective on that generational gap that we're going to dive into. So AJ, welcome to the show.
Thanks. Like to be here. I'm glad I'm here.
All right, AJ, so I want to hear straight from you. What is it like to work with people who are a bit younger than you? What are there challenges that come from it? Are there communication issues that come up that might not with somebody your own age? What do you think about this?
It is challenging sometimes. I came from a company that everybody was like 30 or over. So coming to this new atmosphere and having these younger generations to communicate, it is sometimes difficult. They communicate differently. Also, I think they receive information differently as far as the younger generation. They take a lot of things sometimes personally. So I think it's a big difference in when you come to a younger generation.
So I'm curious, what do you mean they receive information differently? How do they receive it?
I think in the past, when I've talked to somebody around my age, it's more directly like it's professional. It's never personal. So when you give instructions to a younger group, it's like, okay, I know what I'm doing. And it's not that you're questioning their knowledge or understanding what they're doing. It's just you want things done a certain way. And sometimes as a younger generation, they take it more like, well, it's telling me how to do my job. Well, technically, I'm not. I'm telling you the way to do your job better, and it's not like you're doing anything wrong. I just need to do it a certain way to make your job much easier. And sometimes the younger generation take it as that you're trying to tell them what to do and how to do it. And I'm not really tell them how to do it and what to do, just to make it easier for them.
Yeah, I think leadership style is probably something that different generations have a different preference for. So I can understand that. And I've seen that too firsthand. I'm 25, so I'm probably in that generation that takes things a little personally. But great. So what I'm curious about is, do you have to think a little bit more when you're talking to a younger generation, or like how have you gotten around that communication gap when you say like they tend to take things more personally? Have you adapted at all to make things go like more smoothly when you communicate with them?
Yes, I would. Now I would do a break,
Okay.
in my communication. Like I know what I want to say and what I want to say or whatever, and how I want to say it. But then when you talking to someone that generation, you got to approach it totally different. So I take a time out, step back, and say, okay, this is how I'm going to approach it instead of just going and jumping into it because I know that they're going to receive it a little bit different. Like with me, my generation, I'm going to be like, okay, I got it, move on. It's never going to be personal. It's going to be professional. And I'm not saying the generation is not professional, because you guys are. You're a prime example of being professional at 25. You do an awesome job at it. But on the flip side of it, you have a gap there. So you're not going to always receive it, the same way. So with me, I take the time, take a break, and then I come approach it, that way.
Well, awesome. I think our listeners are going to appreciate having that firsthand knowledge. Coming up next, we're going to talk to Lindsay Boccardo, and she is somewhat of an expert in this, so I'm excited to hear what she has to say. But AJ, thank you so much. I appreciate your time.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Okay, well, today we have a great guest. We are joined by Lindsay Bacardo. She is the founder of Lindsay Bacardo Training and Coaching, where she provides education and training around the generational gap. Specifically, she helps group understand how the experiences they had growing up directly affect their relationships at work. I personally have been connected with Lindsay for a little bit now on LinkedIn. I'm really excited to finally speak with her and hear her thoughts on this topic. And honestly, I've relied on her content in the past, so I'm just looking forward to digging into this with you.
Yay! I'm so glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
So big first question, Lindsay.
Yeah.
To what generation do you belong? Is there a name? You buy into the names or what?
I buy into the names when people ask, but there's a lot. I'm so glad we're going to talk about all this. But technically, I'm a millennial. I'm 37 years old, just turned 37. So I was born in 84. I'm kind of on the front end of the millennial
What's the
generation.
cutoff?
Usually you're about 40 years old right now, between 25 and 40 if you're a millennial. So
I have an interesting question. So my wife, she's 39, born in 82.
yeah.
So she's really on that edge, right?
Yes.
And she is a Gen Xer until you get to any discussion of pop culture, and then she's a total millennial.
Yeah. So what makes you say she's a Gen Xer except for pop culture? What are some of the things that you notice that make her a Gen Xer?
Well, I guess it's what I don't notice. I don't notice any difference in how we view the world.
Sure.
And our approach to technology and our approach to jobs and work. And it just seems to be, we have the same view. And that could just be coincidence. Similar worldviews across generations do exist, of course.
Of course.
But then when I start quoting Fletch, and she's like, what are you talking about?
Yeah.
And I'm like,
yeah.
oh, that's right. You are 6 years younger than I.
Isn't that wild?
Yeah.
Isn't that wild how much pop culture plays into everyday conversation, how we reference parts of our lives, we use other people's stories. So yeah, it doesn't surprise me that you would marry somebody that has similar values and worldview to you. And you bring up a very important point. I was just talking about this yesterday in a training. So much of what people want to assign as a boomer thing or millennial thing, a lot of it is psychographic. It's dependent on that individual and how they were raised. So, if you meet a millennial who grew up with a single mom who helped raise her siblings, she's going to have a very different concept around leadership, work ethic, how to play with other people well. She's going to have a different way that she processes life and responsibilities than somebody who is an only child. And that has nothing to do with the generation you were born in. So many of our formative experiences as we're growing up shape the things that influence us at work and how we behave and communicate and treat other people. It's not just, the year you happen to be born in and if you watched MTV.
So it's a way, it sounds like it's, from your point of view, it's much more important on how you were raised that has a bigger impact than on when you were raised.
Yeah. And think about the difference too. And people ask me this all the time, are you talking about upper class research? Are you talking who are we talking about? Are you talking about what economic demographic? There's so many layers that come into play with our attitude and perspective around work. And so the first thing I tell people is it's actually more important that you know your specific teammates and their story and how they were raised and how they view leadership. That's worth so much more because that impacts your day-to-day behavior with them and your empathy towards them versus saying, well, let's see, Lindsay's a millennial, so she probably wants me to text her, so I'm going to do that. Just what about all the other pieces of this individual that make them who they are? So that's why I always it's ironic that I speak about generations And I'm very cautious around labels because when you're really talking about a generation, you're kind of asking somebody, how old are you? And although that shouldn't be offensive, it's kind of an interesting tension that we categorize each other and it's acceptable. Like ageism is acceptable still in many different ways. Like when somebody's like, oh, Lindsay, you look young for a 37-year-old, or you look young for a millennial, or you look old for a millennial. That's kind of an interesting, there's just a weird tension that we allow. So I love talking about generations, and I always encourage people, please know your actual teammates and their story and what has shaped them to this moment, what they're passionate about, if they like cats or dogs. That's that's the kind of stuff that actually informs your everyday interactions.
Yeah, it's interesting. You talk about how ageism is still socially acceptable, and you would never say all women are fill in the blank.
You nailed it. Yeah, exactly. That would be
Yeah.
like, what are you talking about?
You used to. That used to be
Exactly.
acceptable. It's not anymore. But you could say all, I don't know, 30 million boomers are X, and everyone would, oh yes, of course, that's right. Yes, that's true. I
Isn't
read
that
that in the
wild?
USA Today. Yeah.
Well, I mean, speaking of the news, I feel like it's almost feels intentional. They like pit the generations against each other. And I'm curious your take on that. Like, is it really as bad as like the media and like general society makes it out to be, where everyone is just so like different and at odds and can't communicate? And I like when millennials were coming up in the workforce, it was all like millennials suck at this. But then I feel like I think I'm a millennial. I'm kind of like a cusper, but I didn't feel like everyone was out to get me when I got when I entered the workforce, and I hope that, like, our now we have, like, Gen Z coming in, I hope they don't feel that way. Like, what do you find as you talk to people about this?
Well, I have found since I went to coaching school, I learned something very important about the news in general. If we were to sit down, the three of us, and assess the content that is being delivered through any news, I'm not talking about politics, just straight up news. In general, it is spoken through a conflict oriented lens. This is something bad that happened downtown. This is something bad that happened in the suburbs. This is something bad that's happening in the world. The news is designed to pull out conflict mentality in us because humans respond to threats and to negativity more robustly than we respond to hope. If there was a new, and like so many people have done like stand up about this too, if you were like, I'm going to go get a snack in the kitchen, and they were like, coming up next, something that could kill you in your house, you'd be like, oh my gosh, I have to stay and listen. But if they're like, coming up next, we're going to share our dreams and our hopes for the children of the future, you'd be like, off, click, next thing. So,
Yeah.
the news is designed to hold your attention. It's very, and it's ironic that we say like soft news, or, we use different language when it's actually feel good, happy things versus the hard, bad news of life. So it actually has more to do with just that whole industry in general and how they treat information than it has to do with boomers and boomers are the worst, millennials are the best, or whatever dynamics you're hearing. Certainly there are trends. Boomers and millennials are one generation separated. In between them, you have the Gen Xers. But most of the arguing that you see is between boomers and millennials because boomers tend to be the parents of millennials. So there's other layers to those conversations where you're like, my dad, I'm sorry, I meant my boss is a jerk. Like you're really, channeling other relationships in your life. That's part of why you see such tension between those two groups. So it's all those layers. It's complex.
Let's cover that. Let's cover what are the various generational groups that are active today in the workforce. And do you have percentages as far as that relates to, what percentage of the workforce is Gen Z, et cetera?
That is, well, there's a couple different layers to that. The first one is it depends on the industries that you're talking about. And COVID, there's so much information right now about COVID affecting the workforce. I'm not confident in the numbers that I would give you for who's in the workforce and at what percent. Who is active right now? I was just reading articles today about how boomers feel like they're not actually retiring, they're being pushed out. So there's so many layers to that piece. But active in the workforce, you have boomers, you have Gen Xers, you have millennials, and Gen Zs are at the bottom. They're about 20. The oldest are about 25. So the youngest people in the workforce are coming out of college, going into the workforce, and they would be considered Gen Zs. So Gen Zs tend to be up to about 25 years old. And then you have millennials who are typically up to about 40. Now, these numbers wiggle a little bit depending on the sociologist that you're following. So it depends on, who you're following. And again, it's so interesting because all of this all of these numbers and how we talk about it is ultimately a matter of perception and which researcher you're following and what they're saying.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not as clear cut as everybody thinks it is. Like I had somebody once say to me, now, I was born in 1979, but December of 1979. Am I a millennial or am I a Gen Xer? And that's when you start to get into we're not having the right conversation. We're not asking the right questions at that point.
So there's also the greatest generation. There might be somebody 75 years old still plugging away, right?
They can still be. Sometimes you would more likely find them to be mentors or still on the board, but maybe not actively working, potentially still working. And that's the other piece that's changing that you bring up is that we're going to be working till later in life, potentially, because the lifespan is very different than it was when we started doing generational research around the boomers. So yes, they can still be in the workforce for sure. I mean, I know a nurse that's 75, so that's real.
So I'm curious because you deal, or I think from what I know about you, you deal with like helping people overcome like the generational conflict or like how to communicate cross generationally. I'm
Yep.
curious what like the biggest hot button like topics that you cover are, and like what are people struggling with in the workplace when it comes to that generational gap?
There's two big hot button topics that aren't as specific to the individual,
Mm-hmm.
that are truly something we're all experiencing. The first one is our definition of leadership. So if you were to talk to somebody who was raised in the 60s, their definition of leadership, you'll hear phrases about impressing the will of the leader on those being led. You'll hear phrases around authority, power. Ultimately, fear is used. Fear of losing your paycheck. When boomers were coming up through elementary and high school, their principals, their teachers could hit them with a paddle. So they have a very, what I call high view of authority. So you listen, you don't ask why. You don't say, I'd like to give some input into this. You don't do that. That's their view of authority. Now, if you go to the other extreme, look at the way that we raise kids today. They tend to have their family tends to make decisions as a family. Kids are a part of those decisions. Teachers are seen more as a support, a mentor, even a personal hero of those kids. Millennials will say that their top two heroes are their parents and their teachers. If you and I saw in the news today that a teacher went off and hit a kid, everybody would lose their minds. That's not even an option. So the way that we discipline kids and train them to live in society is no longer about fear. It's about collaboration and cooperation. So when somebody who's just out of college comes in to work with you, they're assuming when they walk in that you want to hear them, you want to hear their opinion, you want to co-create solutions with them, that you're going to collaborate. And you can imagine if you've been a leader for 30 years and you know that you call the shots and you have authority, that could be looked at as very disrespectful, arrogant, entitled. That gets interpreted very differently
that
when you're
sounds
really
like a big
talking
one.
about an evolving view of leadership. Can you see that kind of in your own life? Can you like kind of see how that might be happening?
Oh yeah. I mean, so with Argument, I mean, we definitely lean far heavier towards like the support mentor side of leadership. And it's actually a big thing we've talked about on the podcast before. We're in manufacturing, so we have a lot of people who come from the environment that's much more like the like authority, fear, maybe not fear, that's my the authority side of the spectrum.
Yep.
And it's almost like a culture shock, like when they come into Archimed, because like they have to like adjust to our leadership style. And it's always like the first, depends on the person, but like 90 days to potentially like a year. It's like, us just trying to like build that relationship with them, because sometimes you can tell it's like you might have someone who's never been allowed to like tell their actual opinion on something,
Yep.
or they'll be like reprimanded in some way.
Yep.
And we're sitting there like, wait, no, we really want your opinion because like we hired you because you're the expert in this. And like I am not the expert in that. Like I don't know what I'm talking about. Please tell me what you think. And so that's something that we have dealt with.
Yep.
Um,
And they don't
and we
believe
see
you,
it we
though.
see it most when we're pulling from another like manufacturing company.
Caroline, don't you think that when you tell them, it's, please share and raise your hand and contradict the boss if you think the answer is not right, and it takes them a long time for them to believe you.
It's like they have to do it once and see what happens, and, like, at least that's what I've seen, and Lindsay, I'm curious to see if you have, like, some magic formula here that would help me out, but typically, it's like once they start talking and see that we're not just gonna be like, okay, that's like 5 points against your record because you spoke out of turn. I don't think it's actually that bad, but once we like just listen to them, whether or not like whatever they suggest gets implemented, I think that tends to help. But typically, like yeah, they have to give us the opportunity to like show them. But I'm Lindsay, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think what you're really talking about there too is work from Amy Edmondson around psychological safety. She has a book called Fearless Organization, and she talks about this. I hear you saying between the lines that depending on somebody's history with leadership, when they come in, they may or may not feel safe to just share what they already know. And psychological safety is where we create an environment where people can speak up without fear of being punished, where they can be wrong and they won't feel like if I mess this one thing up and people find out, I'm going to be in trouble. That you can speak openly about what you're learning, how you're growing, and what you need. And that has more to do with every individual choosing and to grow, become self-aware, and create a space where differences of opinion and diversity are seen as a positive thing. So you're
Yeah.
really helping people not be afraid.
Yeah, I wonder what you think about this fact. Um, our our bosses, our authority figures are Gen Xers, not Boomers,
Hmm.
and so I think that we have a more uh, influence versus authority leadership style.
Yes. Well, and you're lucky too, because talking about numbers in the workplace, we know that there are 10 million less Gen Xers in the population. I can't say workplace because a bunch of Gen Xers had to go home and take care of their kids during COVID, but in general, there's less Gen Xers in the workplace than there are boomers and millennials. And so it's really cool when you have them as leaders because they kind of understand the way of doing things pre-technology and that older version of leadership around authority and fear. But they also, what I have found is that they have found a way to bridge and see the positives of the future and see that things need to change and they will change. And that can be a good thing. So that's fantastic that you have that. And, the same thing happens to millennials too. Millennials were the break point, the end of the millennial generation from 1980 to about 1995. That break at 1995 is the beginning of the internet being used in a ubiquitous, like everybody's got it in their home. It's being used between 1995 and 1999. We saw the schools get flooded with them. So you also have that next generation millennials also remember having like a phone that was attached to the wall. They remember pre-iPhone when I had to have an Encyclopedia Britannica at my house to learn anything. So there are some real interesting, these generations, Gen Xers and millennials, are the bridge, which is the second biggest tension is technology. So we talked about leadership definition. The second one is the use of technology. Now it's human nature that when new technology is brought in, there are people that resist it because we don't know what it means. It's like stepping into the unknown again. This happened with the bicycle. This happened with the radio. The first time the radio came into American
Wow.
homes, the American Psychiatric Association released a statement about how dangerous this could be for children to be listening
Wow.
to outside messages. Yeah. And so, it's like I just posted today on LinkedIn about how to work with a boss that might be technologically resistant, because there's always a balance to be had to understand the human response to technology and to find ways to utilize it to save us time, energy, resources. But all of us live in that tension.
Yeah. If you can believe this, I was working with a company, not as an employee, but the CEO resisted the use of email within his company until the 90s, and with himself until like 2000. If you wanted to email him, you had to email his assistant, and then she like printed it out and put it on his desk. If you
That
can
is
believe it.
wild.
Yeah.
And so that's where, like, you probably value efficiency. And
Yes.
that is a value that tends to be a value of younger generations right now, because technology has taught us, like, I can order a Starbucks and have it ready before I walk in the door. That seems like a good thing. And we tend to think through that lens of saving time and efficiency. But some of that is because if you're raised with that on your mind all the time, it's natural that you're going to think that way, where you're exactly right. I met a boomer who was like, yeah, I never used email until I was 48. That is an interesting time to bring this whole new layer of communication into your world.
Well, but then the other hand, this same person values relationships much more over transactions, and he rather walk into the same coffee shop and say, "Hey, Mary, good morning. How you doing? How's school?" Get his coffee and have a relationship with
That's
Hmm.
my
the
dad.
barista. And so
Yep,
I
he
see that also, and there's sort of a lamenting of the slow death of relationships, and having all those being replaced by just sort of transactions.
100%. And there is neuroscience research around what you're talking about, that humans really do need to be within 10 feet of each other physically to impact each other's well being. We are social creatures, and we do live in packs by nature. And being in physical proximity to somebody actually changes your chemistry in your blood. It changes the way that your nervous system works, versus us being even on Zoom. There's a whole book about this, published through HBR. It's called Can You Hear Me? I have it somewhere. It's somewhere spread out over all my books. But it's by Nick Morgan. Can You Hear Me? It's about the effect of using technology to communicate, and how and when to use it, and when you still really do need that in-person connection. So can you see how half of what we talked about is not about generations? It's about embracing change and everybody having to do that between leadership definitions and technology. I mean, there's going to come, but in our lifetime, there's a good chance that we'll definitely be using virtual reality, but I'll be like hologramming into a conference in Colorado from Indiana.
Hmm.
That's crazy to think about. And our kids are going to be like, yeah, it's totally normal. Why would you put your body on a plane and fling it across the United States?
So you
That's
you
going to
can
be
give
far
that
away.
person a hug. You know, COVID, I think, was an example of that sort of how hard it was to not have relationships. There was a time where one of our employees was really going through a very tough time, and what she needed was a hug,
Yeah,
a
that's right.
physical interaction with another human being, but she couldn't get it at work because, it's hard to hug someone who's 6 feet away.
You're
yeah.
exactly right.
Lindsay, I know we're running up on time here, but I wish we could keep talking, so maybe we can find another time to continue this. But thank you so, so much for joining us today. I really loved your insight, and I liked your point. It's less about generations, and it's more about, that in-person communication and the understanding that comes with that.
You got it.
So, yeah, thank you so much, and hopefully we can speak again.
You're welcome. I'm so glad I got to be here. Thanks for having me.
Thanks so much. So, Caroline, I thought this was really interesting that we started to talk about uh, generational gaps and the issues of working with folks from 4 different generations, maybe 5 if you work where the greatest generation still works. Yet our expert said that it's more about how you were raised and not so much when you were raised. So maybe Maybe it's not generational.
Well, yeah, so first, I really feel like this was an episode where we ran out of time, right? There was so much to talk about, and I'm excited to continue learning, but I loved that immediately Lindsay was like, "No, it's not about the generations. We need to stop labeling people ways because there's so much more that goes into who we are as people." And as you pointed out, Greg, if we started saying everybody who has blonde hair acts a certain way, which I guess I should have picked a different analogy because people have a lot to say about blondes sometimes. But that's not okay, right? That's generalizing. You're making a sweeping assumption. But we do this all the time with generations, and we start grouping people together in ways that maybe there are some similarities there, but often might not be completely fair, and has a lot more to do with how we're raised and um, the experiences we had growing up.
Yeah, that's the a much bigger driver of what you bring into work than what generation you come from. And so it led us to the question: why is society so obsessed with talking about how millennials are this and Gen Xers are that? And it comes down to news. And Lindsay, um, you know, highlighted, I guess, what we've seen for a while with news, that that sometimes they just muck it up and
Mhm.
don't get it right, and their goal is to sell more ads with and get more eyeballs, and how do you do that? Conflict. So news is through what she called the conflict oriented lens, because that triggers more eyeballs, and that's more ads, rather than hope or some other mechanism. And so I think that when the news talks about generational gaps and generational conflicts, and that's sort of what brought us through this to this lens that we look through, but it's not really about generations. So what is it about?
I mean, it's about, as you mentioned, how we were raised, but I think there were some big themes that we talked about, right? Where there are these conflicts that come up in work, and it's less about, as you said, the generation, and more about how we were raised. So, for example, Lindsay brought up leadership. So a lot of people were raised with more of that authoritarian style of figures. So if you're a little bit older, corporal punishment used to be allowed in schools. Whereas Lindsay pointed out today, if we heard that somebody was hitting a kid in the classroom, we would all we'd melt down. We'd be freaking out. We'd be trying to press charges. It wouldn't fly. So we have this group of people who grew up learning you do what you're told because I said so. And now we have some younger people coming into the workforce who are so used to being heard, having input, being able to go up to that authority figure and just speak their mind and share their feelings. And this is so foreign to people who grew up with that more strict upbringing. And that's where the communication issues come in. And I get it. I feel like I've had those moments where I'm going into to someone's office saying, I really feel like we should be doing this, or this is what I'm thinking. And they're looking at me like I have three heads. And they're like, no, we're not doing it that way, because to them, they've been there, they have the experience, they've seen a lot more than I have. And they feel like they know the right way of doing it.
Yeah, so that definition of leadership, you have maybe maybe it reflects what society was like, and so it's less about I'm a boomer, and therefore I believe in leadership through authority versus influence, but
Hmm.
and rather it's if that's how society was at that time. And now, today, society demands from leaders to lead through influence rather than authority. So the question isn't what generation were you from, but do you have the capacity to change with the times? So embrace that change. And no matter how old you are, you can be a great leader if you understand that today's society um, gives you more points if you lead through influence than through authority, as an example.
Well, yeah, and the other thing I loved was, now I feel like I shouldn't be using the generational terms, but I'm going to. People we think of as Gen X, which Archimed happens to have a good number of those individuals as leaders. Lindsay said these people are great at kind of adapting because they've seen it both ways. And those are the people who can change and embrace going from maybe a more strict or fear-based authoritarian style to that support, mentor, influencing style. And I think those are really the adapters in the workforce right now. And I feel like they're the glue that's holding everything together. So I'm wondering what happens down the line when they're not here anymore.
Well, the Gen Xers are not here anymore?
Yeah, like way down the line.
Way, way, way down the line, right?
Yes, Greg, yes.
Okay, just making sure.
I don't mean dead, I mean like not working.
Oh, all right.
And what, like
Just making sure. Okay, because
50 years? Like
yeah,
80 years? How
that's
many
fine.
years are
That's
we
fine.
putting out there?
So the other point she made that sometimes produces conflict is technology.
Yes.
And I will say, as a Gen Xer, the technologies that are new to me are much more difficult than the ones I'm used to. And I remember when, I guess, what was it, around 2000 or so, people started to text. And they'd have
Yes.
these flip phones, and then to text, you'd have to hit like the number 4 3 times to get to the third letter, and
Yep.
it took forever. And I thought, oh, this is the first technology that I'm never going to use.
Yeah, I think that was T9, I believe it was called.
Okay. I have no
don't-
idea.
Well, but I remember playing Snake, like on my mom's Nokia. That was like the one game that they had, and I'd sit there and play Snake, and I never got very far. But yeah, and then I feel like it was so fast. Then the first generation iPhones were coming out, and I remember being like 10 or something, laying on my mom's bedroom floor, just completely enamored with this phone because we'd never seen anything like it before.
And then you have Facebook changing their name to Meta or whatever
I
that
know,
is.
I heard about that.
And their goal is so that everyone, lives in one big virtual universe and does everything through a
They're gonna take over the world.
icon or what do you call those things? Avatars. And I'm sure that there are Gen Zers who are thinking, yes, this is awesome. And I'm thinking this is like a dystopian novel, like a Aldous Huxley novel.
I think Facebook is not very popular with the Gen Zers. Gavin, our intern, is on. I feel like you're more of a Gen Z. Just nod if you like Facebook still.
No nodding.
That was a shaking. That was a shaking of the head.
I actually used Facebook to, find information like, if you want to know what the best internet provider in your area is. I think it's useful for that kind of stuff. But after this name change, I thought, you know what, I've had enough. So I just deleted my account, and now I'm just on LinkedIn, and that's it. So technology does seem to be embraced and valued and interacted with in a different way depending on who you are. And I also find that some folks who grew up in maybe the older side of the Gen Xers and the Boomers, they seem to value relationships over transactions. And I know that's a broad brush, but sometimes technology is more transactional than it is relational. And that might be one of the disconnects. Some people want a relationship with their barista, and some people just want the coffee, waiting for them, and they walk in and grab it and leave.
Yeah, I love that you bring up that example because I am that person. I'm on the app, I'm ordering my coffee ahead of time. My dad, who is a boomer, he will seek out the best local espresso place he can find, and he will get to know everybody in there, and they know him by name, and they know his order, and then he starts tweaking the espresso, process, whatever. He gets all involved. But it is funny. It's like I would never do that. I'd feel so uncomfortable. I'm like, I want the app. I want it to be quick, and I do not want to talk to anyone.
Yeah, I suppose, like a lot of things, there's a balance between these two topics. Sometimes you want to be quick, and sometimes you want to know who runs the neighborhood coffee shop, and view that person as a person who's doing a job and taking pride in their work and making you a beautiful cup of coffee, and you want to thank them by name. I guess it's a balance.
Yeah. The other thing that I think is especially timely right now, apparently, in order to have an impact on each other, we have to be within 10 feet of each other to have a real impact. I mean, COVID, I want to say we're on the tail end of it, but who really knows? We've had this 6 feet rule in place forever.
Yeah.
And it makes you wonder how all of this is going to have the impact, because I felt like, okay, well, we can still FaceTime people. I can wave to someone from across the room. I can, we can use Teams and Zoom and all of that. But it is curious to me, are we still having that same connection? And do communication mishaps happen? Are they happening more? I guess is something I'm curious about. Maybe something we have to dig in to in another episode. But with all of this space, like, what's that really doing to how we talk to each other?
Yeah, and no matter what generation you're from, you need the human touch. You need to sit down and have a meal with somebody, and every once in a while you need a hug.
Hmm.
And no matter whether you're from the greatest generation or the millennial generation, I think we're gonna have to find the right balance of acknowledging what our human needs are, which are relationships, in part at least, versus enjoying the efficiency that the technology affords us, and even if it's transactional in nature. But there's, like you said, there's a lot more to talk about. I had a question that we didn't get to about sort of looking in the crystal ball. What are the I don't know what my kids are. What generation are they forming, and what will the tensions look like in 10 years or in 20 years? So maybe we can do a part two of this, because it's interesting, and maybe we'll shift from talking about a generational gap to talking about a how you were raised gap.
Yeah. Yeah, I think we definitely need to do a part two. So everybody stay tuned for that. We'll keep you updated, because that was the thing with this one. I felt like we needed like endless amounts of time to dig in, which of course none of us had. So we will update this one and circle back to it.
Cool, thanks.
All right, on our next episode, we'll be doing another book review with our CEO, John DeSalvo. This time, it's all about positivity. We are talking about the book The Happiness Advantage by Sean Ackworth.